everybody, and welcome to our training video, How to Teach News, Transforming Your Classroom into a Newsroom. We are Sorcha and Paul from the NewsWise team here at the Guardian Foundation. NewsWise is a cross-curricular news literacy programme for 7 to 11-year-olds. We are run in partnership by the Guardian Foundation, the National Literacy Trust and the PSHE Association. We offer a fully planned suite of lessons with more than 100 resources, pupil workshops, a chance to hear from real journalists and CPD for teachers. The whole project has been created by literacy, news and PSHE education specialists. I'm now going to hand over to Paul as we begin by thinking about the importance of developing your pupils' critical literacy skills.
So before we get started, take a moment to pause the video and reflect on what your practice looks like right now when it comes to teaching the news. Think about these questions. In which subjects might you teach news? What skills are you able to cover when you're teaching news? And if you're writing the news, what stories do pupils tend to write about? Teaching and discussing the news is what we refer to as news literacy. At NewsWise, we help teachers to develop effective news literacy teaching in the primary classroom. Writing news reports is a key element of news literacy, but there are other important strands to cover too. Pupils need to be equipped to confidently navigate the news, including online and on social media. We see news literacy as having 3 core strands. First of all, understanding the news. This is all about immersing pupils in the news and the text type of written reports. During this strand, pupils explore how and why the news is produced, why it's so important, and how it can make us feel. The second strand is critically navigating the news. In this strand, the focus is shifted to those vital critical literacy skills. Pupils learn how to spot when news is fake, understand the difference between facts and opinions, and they learn about balance and bias. Finally is reporting real news. In the final strand, pupils are empowered to share their voice. They should also recognise that news doesn't have to be the big global stories. They should learn that news can be both for them and by them. These learning journeys show the paths that pupils follow as they become critical readers and finish by reporting their own news stories. They're both structured like a literacy or English project, beginning by immersing children in the text type, considering purpose and audience, and then moving on to those more complex critical analysis skills. They'll of course finish by reporting the news for themselves. In the unit for 7 to 9-year-olds, they'll work on a script for an audio broadcast, giving plenty of opportunities to develop your pupils' oracy skills. Whereas in the unit for 9 to 11-year-olds, pupils will produce a written news report, putting all their skills to use in some writing. Because of the nature of news, there is also a citizenship and PSHE education element about the emotional impact of news and how we can respond to news and information, especially online. The learning journey is underpinned by the Journalist Training School, which we'll talk more about in a moment. All of the lesson plans and resources you need are available on our website. They're completely free to download. You'll find a link to the NewsWise website in the video description. The NewsWise values are also at the core of our resources. These values capture what we believe good journalism to be. First of all, truthful, meaning we expect journalists to report the truth. Second, fair, meaning we expect news reporting to treat everyone involved in the story respectfully. Balanced means that we should expect to hear both sides of the story. And interesting means that news reporting should include stories that the audience actually wants to hear. Our training video on balance and bias explains the values in more detail. Each of our lessons links to one or more of these values, and pupils can use these values to analyse reports that they read in class, as well as when they produce their own news reports. And this is a good opportunity to highlight just how news literacy covers many areas of the English and literacy curricula across the UK. From those core comprehension skills, like summarising, fact retrieval, all the way through to those higher level reading skills, such as distinguishing between fact and opinion, analysing language, structure and presentation, and of course inference. Writing news also covers the entire writing process, from planning to drafting to editing. What's more, all of these skills are related to real-life jobs in the newsroom, so news writing allows pupils to easily see the purpose behind every part of the writing process. We're going to focus on writing skills today, but as we've discussed in our other training videos, news literacy is best taught in a cross-curricular way. There are many areas of statutory and non-statutory guidance on PSHE education, health education, and digital literacy that can also be met by teaching news literacy effectively.
Turning your classroom into a newsroom will increase pupils' engagement in news literacy and lead to better outcomes. But to bring the real-world context of the newsroom to life for your pupils, they and you will need to know what really happens inside a newsroom. Here you can see a photo of the morning conference. Every day in a newsroom starts with this. Journalists will discuss the main issues of the day, which ones they might report on, and what approach they might take. There are lots of different roles in a newsroom, all of which come under the banner of journalism. You might have heard of some of them, but others might be less familiar. So we have a reporter, who is the person who researches and reports and writes the news story. We have a sub-editor, who is the person who reads the reporter's work and corrects mistakes. They also double-check the facts and they write headlines and captions. A picture editor is the person who chooses which pictures to use with a story. And finally, the chief editor or the editor-in-chief. This is the person who's in charge and makes all the final decisions. On our website, you can find different explainer videos of different journalists talking about what their roles are and what they mean. You can hear from a reporter, a sub-editor, a producer, and a presenter from The Guardian's editorial team, as well as the person in charge of it all, The Guardian's editor-in-chief. Having pupils understand the different jobs in the newsroom means that they can take on these roles in the classroom, making the learning experience real and engaging. A really exciting way to teach news literacy lessons is by setting up a journalist training school. The idea here is to make your classroom feel like a newsroom as much as possible and to get your pupils learning the real skills of real life journalism. Doing this means that your pupils enter the classroom knowing that they are journalists with a really important job to do. In our lesson resources, you can find the mission video where the pupils are welcome to journalist training school. They'll be given the challenge of researching and reporting their own real news story whilst avoiding fake news along the way. We have also produced training journals that can be downloaded from our website. Pupils can use these to self-assess their progress as journalists. Another thing to know about the real newsroom is that it is full of newspapers. It's important for journalists to know what other news organisations are reporting, so you will see all of the major news outlets represented in a real newsroom. This can also be a good lesson for your pupils about the importance of having a varied news diet. When providing real newspapers in class, it's important to make sure, though, that an adult has looked through them first and to remove any unsuitable stories, because obviously you don't know what the news of the day is going to be. Working walls and classroom displays can be used as well. You could get some clocks and have different time zones on display, just like a real newsroom actually does have. It's a really nice idea as well to have time zones that are relevant to your class and your pupils. So, for example, you might have your town or city rather than just the major global cities. Your working wall could also be used to display research and draft reports. You could include the NewsWise value poster, the navigator, and photos of real journalists at work. Pupils can also use this space to share good examples of news stories they found that they might have enjoyed reading. Whilst you're teaching, you can also use countdowns and deadlines. All these things will really emulate what it's like in a newsroom. If your pupils are at the stage of reporting their own news stories, you could also hold daily news conferences for pupils to share progress with their class, discussing their stories, asking questions, and problem solving together. This works really well if you have pupils who are working in different editorial teams on different stories. A few more things that you can do to make your newsroom come to life. So firstly, come up with a name for your news organisation and make sure you know who your audience are. So are you a newspaper for your school community? Are you writing for a wider audience? And what is your name going to be? You could even make a sign for your classroom door so everyone knows what the newsroom is called. Incorporating role play is a really nice idea. So remember, you're the editor-in-chief in your classroom, you're in charge, you are the big boss of the newsroom whilst your children are in role as journalists. You could even make a sign for your desk or wear a hat like you can see here. Pupils can also wear press passes for news literacy lessons that they must have them on them at all times. Visit our website to find a template that you can download and print out.
Bringing those real roles from the newsroom into your classroom can add a level of authenticity and excitement to the learning experience for your children. So now we're going to try out one of those roles for ourselves. For this next activity, you're going to become a desk editor. Now, the desk editor is the person who's in charge of a specific section. For example, it might be the national, the international, the entertainment, sport, or science desk. They're going to have to make decisions about what stories to cover in their section, deciding which stories are newsworthy and therefore which stories they want to report. And they might use a news criteria for this. So, for example, they might think about, number one, the subject, who the story is about. The story is going to be more newsworthy if lots of people have heard about the person or if it's someone who's local to them. Number two, time. When did it happen? That's a really important thing to think about as well. And also, number three, the element of surprise. Is it going to shock or surprise people? There's also a challenge level here that you could use with your children, which is to think about the place where it happened. And it's also important to think about your audience as well. If you're a national news organisation, then a story here about the planet that smells of rotten eggs might seem more important to you than something that's really hyper local. So pause the video for a moment, decide what type of news organisation you are, and use the criteria to decide on which of these headlines are going to be your top story for the day. The headlines are: Woman living with spinal injury swims channel, First blind Barbie doll released, Scientists find that planet smells of rotten eggs, Road closed after burst water main, and New shop opens in town. So what did you think? Perhaps you decided to run the science desk and felt that planet that smells of rotten eggs was the top story of the day. Or maybe you were a local news organisation and decided that your readers needed to hear about that burst water main and how it was going to affect them. What were the stories that you discounted as not interesting or important enough as well? Did you consider what your audience would be most interested in? This activity is really helpful for showing children that newsworthiness is completely subjective and the audience will make a big difference about what is most important. And when making the learning experience immersive for your pupils, it's important to make everything real and authentic wherever possible. We found that relating learning to the real world is really engaging for pupils. And that's why we always use examples of real news reports in our resources. Appropriate stories don't always have to be fun or unchallenging. They can be challenging stories about social issues. Stories like these often get the best responses from pupils. When using these stories, children's sense of social justice is really engaged, and that makes for a powerful and a much more memorable learning experience for them. Several news stories are included in our units of work, but you can also find a list of places to find appropriate stories on our website. There are lots of other ways you can engage your pupils with the news as well. For example, a newspaper or news website scavenger hunt can be a good thing to do. Watching breaking news stories in class, you can use these exciting news moments to get your children interested in talking about the news. You can also take time to discuss news stories and give children space to form, share, and challenge opinions. Discussions and class assemblies are a really good way to do this. And as we mentioned earlier, newsrooms have newspapers strewn all over every surface. So there are also TV screens showing rolling news. So keeping that news in your classroom can be a really good way into doing it. Journalists are immersed in news, so you can encourage that reading news for pleasure by providing these resources for your pupils. There are lots of child-friendly titles available, and your school may even have a subscription to one or more of them. You may want to raise current local news stories as well. You should also encourage pupils to take home resources such as our NewsWise Navigator. We have a downloadable NewsWise pack for families as well, so you can keep your pupils learning, discussing and sharing news beyond your classroom. You can find this on our website and you could even share it on your school newsletter.
We are now going to focus a bit more on writing outcomes. Teachers often report that they find news writing a very difficult genre to teach, so we're going to explore what effective news writing looks like. Here you can see our news writing toolkit, which is broken down into structural, language, and layout features. This is just one of the many writing resources available from our website. Let's look at these features in the context of a real news report. Here you can see an example news report from the Guardian webpage about how dogs are being used to help the rewilding of a nature reserve in Lewis. Starting with how a news report is put together, we always begin with a 5W introduction. This is a sentence that summarises the key information of the story: the who, what, where, when, and why. The important thing to note here is that the introduction always begins with the most interesting or important detail. That's often the who or the what of the story. It's never the date. An easy way to explain this to children is to get them thinking about how you might discuss news with a friend. If you were told, "I've got some news to tell you," the first question asked is usually, "What's happened?" not "When did it happen?" After the 5W introduction, we go on to give additional details about the story, which will both interest and inform the reader. This is also where we'll bring in quotes from those who are close to the events of the news story, or maybe even have an expert view. In terms of structure, you'll notice that news reports use really short paragraphs. This is to make it easy for readers to understand quickly, so there is a real purpose to the structure. A simple way to understand this is to begin a new paragraph whenever a new fact or quote or idea is given. We end a news report with additional context or information. There is no conclusion or "thanks for reading." A news report just ends. In this case, extra context is given as the report finishes with a quote explaining that there has been some early signs of success from the scheme, but goes on to say that it will take slightly longer for the plans to establish. We use the inverted pyramid to talk about how a report should be structured. So all the key information is shared straight away, and this is by design. In terms of language, the key to news writing is to use formal and concise language. People should also write in third person and use the past tense. This is very different to what we see in narrative writing with lengthy descriptions and expanded noun phrases. With news writing, we want to get to the point in the simplest way. In fact, a key sub-editing skill in news writing is to get rid of unnecessary or redundant words. News writing is also a really good opportunity to work on relative clauses. Direct and indirect speech should also be used. This style of writing is quite tricky for children, and you'll often see them writing reports in the style of a newsreader, finishing with phrases like "thank you for reading, see you next time." That's why immersing them in the style of news writing with lots of opportunities to read and discuss news examples is so important. Some of the features marked here are aimed at a more upper primary level. This is to highlight the difference between expectations in terms of outcomes between younger and older pupils. With younger pupils, you might focus on direct speech, while you could challenge older pupils with including reported speech. There are also some opportunities for challenge when it comes to embedding direct speech into the report, such as moving where the reporting clause is used and punctuating more complex quotes accurately. Maintaining a consistent tense throughout a piece of writing is also a skill you might want to focus on with older rather than younger pupils, with the added challenge of tense switching for more advanced learners. Finally, let's think about layout features. We have our headline, our picture and caption, and our byline, which says who wrote the report. You should also expect to see the date. You can also see a stand first on this page, which some news reports will include. This is a bit like a subheading or a second headline. It's an opportunity to add extra detail that you couldn't fit into the headline in order to encourage people to read on and find out more. A stand first is another good feature for bringing in an element of challenge by focusing on the skills of summarising and using concise language. It's important to say that this is the easy bit. If you add these features to a piece of writing, it will look like a news report, but they don't work by themselves. You need the language and structure to also fit the purpose of the writing. In a real newsroom, these bits would only be added after everything else was completed, and that is how we have organised it in our learning journey, so we're really mirroring the real process of the newsroom.
So thinking about that reporting toolkit and the example we've looked at, which of these paragraphs is the most successful and why? Pause the video for a moment and think about what we've just talked about and decide which of these 3 5W introductions would be the most successful. I'll read them to you as well. Number 1, a family was left shocked today after they were surprised with an invitation back to a museum. On their first visit to the museum, something went badly wrong. The 4-year-old son went to touch a Bronze Age jar, but made a mistake and knocked it to the ground. It was smashed to pieces. Number 2, a 4-year-old who smashed a priceless Bronze Age vase was invited back to the Hecht Museum today. And number 3, on 28th of August, a museum director invited a 4-year-old and his family to return to the museum after a Bronze Age vase was accidentally broken. So a news story must grab the reader as soon as they begin. So the first words of a report must be the most important or interesting fact. A key to good news reporting and editing is identifying what the key point of interest is. This is often who the story is about, or it could also be about what has happened. It's almost never when the story happened. This is generally implicit in the story in any case. News is generally reported just after it happened, and most of the time it's not essential to understanding what the news story is about. Front adverbials tend not to appear in genuine news reports. A reporter would never start a report with on 28th of August unless the date was absolutely key to the story. So hopefully you were able to realise that number 2 was the most successful 5W introduction. It cut straight to the most important detail straight away, whereas number 1 included almost too much information that wasn't important to the story, and number 3, of course, started with that date rather than the what or the who. So when you're teaching news reports, it's important to teach the structural, layout and language features in context and introducing children to high quality models of news. This means that children can understand there's a real purpose to each of those features. Take a look at this example of a report written by a Year 5 pupil. What have they done well and what could be improved? Pause the video for a moment and think about the layout, structure and language features. As the original copy is difficult to read, we've enlarged the 2 paragraphs on the left side of the screen. I'll quickly read those to you now. It all began on Tuesday afternoon at 5:30 p.m. behind the equipment shed. On the field lay a small, shiny UFO. To their disbelief, the teachers listened to a confusing, terrifying voicemail. Miss Austin, Year 5 teacher, said that she felt very nervous and worried after discovering the crash. Miss Taylor, Year 6 teacher, added, "I couldn't believe what I saw. I'm still in shock." So let's start by looking at the layout. We can see they've included a headline as well as a picture and a caption. And let's move on to the structure. We can see that this example begins with a date, which we know to avoid. However, this opening paragraph does go on to outline the rest of the 5Ws, so they've done a good job there. The second paragraph that we enlarged expertly demonstrates the reported and direct speech, and we can also see relative clauses being used really effectively too. And in the final paragraph, we can see that the report finishes with an appropriate ending, a sort of what happens next, as we saw on that inverted pyramid. So finally, if we think about the language used, some of it is formal and third person, especially in the second paragraph that we enlarged. However, there's also some language which would be better placed in narrative writing. For example, the phrase, "it all began," and the descriptive language that's used to describe the UFO and the voicemail. There's a danger with including too much descriptive language that you make it A, more difficult for the reader to understand the facts, and B, you might even introduce some bias as well. So we remodeled the opening paragraph to remove those redundant words and to make the language more formal and concise, and this is what we came up with. A UFO landed in a school playground on Tuesday afternoon. Teachers discovered that the alien landing was accompanied by a message left on the school voicemail. But is there anything else that strikes you about this story? The stimulus for the story is, of course, complete fiction. You can imagine how this lesson or sequence of lessons played out with a really fun role play set up in the school. But as a result, it's difficult for the pupils to then realise they have to use that formal, concise language that we'd expect to see in news reporting. We know that it's common practice in primary schools when it comes to news writing to sort of link it to a fictional text or maybe a historical topic. For example, writing a news report about an event in a story. But we also know that news writing can be a really tricky form of writing for pupils to muster. So when pupils are writing non-fiction in the context of fictional events, they can kind of struggle to switch between the fictional language they've been immersed in and the formal language of news reporting. Whereas when pupils write about a real event for a real purpose and a real audience, it A, increases their motivation and enjoyment for writing, but it B, helps them to understand the text type, which in turn produces much better writing outcomes. So if this teacher had maybe focused on something that was real, they may find that they'd lose some of that story language.
While reporting real news in your classroom might seem challenging, there are many benefits to doing so. As we mentioned a moment ago, you'll see better writing outcomes. It's really hard to turn a fictional scenario into a news report. Journalists don't do it, so why would we expect our pupils to be able to do so? It can be a really empowering experience. You're giving your pupils agency in the issues they want to cover, which will further increase motivation. And by exploring real news stories, you're encouraging debate, active listening, and respecting the views of others. You'll also develop your pupils' understanding of the world. They'll be able to explore local, national, or global issues in depth and look at different sides of the argument. It's a great way for children to begin to understand their place in the world. Sharing a pupil-led newspaper or inviting families in to see pupils' final reports about local issues can be a really good way to engage parents and families. We've seen some schools in the past hosting a graduation event to really make journalist training school come to life. And finally, this is about your pupils having a voice. No one is telling the world what it's like to be 7, 8, 9, or 10, but their voice is as valid and important as anyone else's. Here are some examples of real news stories pupils have reported in the past to give you some inspiration. We've also included who the pupils interviewed to get their quotes for their reports. In terms of the news that your pupils could report on, it could be either about a school, a community issue, or an investigation of a current national or social issue. In reporting on something local, you could keep your reporting inside the school gates by reporting on something new, like a new reward system. Alternatively, you might focus on more of a community issue, like the pupils who wrote about fly tipping in their area. If your pupils want to focus on something more national, think of ways that you can still make it relevant to your school or community. For example, the pupils who wrote about the success of the Lionesses interviewed a local girls' football team coach. As the chief editor of your newsroom, you can veto any topic you consider too risky or unsuitable for your pupils. After all, you know them best. Every newsroom has an editorial meeting where story ideas are discussed and the best ideas are taken forward. You can recreate this with your pupils. A good way to do this is to have your pupils record all their ideas for stories they would like to report and have an open discussion about which ones to take forward. If this might be too challenging for your pupils, then you can offer a selection of stories for them to choose from. Again, you can use the opportunity for discussion with your class, inviting them to share why they like a particular story and how they may be able to meet the NewsWise values as they report it. It's important that they have some say in which story they think is most newsworthy. Finally, a real news story needs a real audience. So have a think about how you could bring an audience to your pupils' work. This might be via a school newspaper, which can be an excellent way to bring your pupils' stories to life. You could upload stories to your school website or have pupils share news bulletins in assemblies. You can invite families in to read the stories and share in the successes of their young journalists, or even a real local journalist into school to give feedback. And finally, we love to read your pupils' reports, so send them to us. We even publish some on our website. Throughout this video, we've mentioned a lot of our resources. All of these resources are available absolutely free from our website. You can see the address on screen now, and the link is in the video description. On our website, you'll also find the other training videos in this series.